Welcome to the fastest daf in town. Today, we're going to Masechtas Ksuvas Daf Lamed Hey. We are going to begin on Lamed Hey Amud Aleph, the third line from the top. So we were discussing a situation between the opinions of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, which discusses if you have Chayve Misas Shaygigin, or for that matter, Chayve Malkus Shaygigin. In other words, a person b'shogeg violates something in which, if they would have done it on purpose, they would have gotten malchus, or they would have received the death penalty. So on this, the question is whether or not you're going to be chayav to pay. Rav Yochanan says you're chayav, and Reish Lakish says you're potter. The reason why, was we concluded in yesterday's daf, is Rav Yochanan says you're chayav because since you didn't get the hasra for the malchus, so therefore we say that doesn't apply, and therefore you're just chayav to pay. Reish Lakish says doesn't matter, you're still potter, because if you would have received the hasra, then you would be potter from paying. So now that you didn't receive hasra for malchus, so you're also not going to have to pay. So again, this is the machlokas. Again, when it comes to these cases of Chayve Misas Shaygin, Chayve Malchus Shaygin, this is v'davar acher, whether or not a person is going to be obligated to have to pay in those situations. So now let's see the Gemara. Omar Rabbi. So this Rabbi asked the question: Mi ika l'man de omer? Is there really anyone that says that Chayve Misas Shaygin Chayovin, that if a person violates something in which they would receive the death penalty, but since it was done b'shogeg, so obviously they're not going to be sentenced to death, but not only that, but they will still be obligated to have to pay. Vatano de Mechizkia, the famous Gemara over here, which is said in many places. Pasuk says Maki Adam Maki Behema, referring to hitting and harming an animal and hitting and harming a person. So what is the connection between the two? So we say like this: Ma Maki Behema, when it comes to hitting an animal and killing an animal, so there's a chiyuv that you have to pay. So we say lo chalakta boy. We don't make any distinction bein b'shoygeg, if you ended up doing this b'shoygeg, or bein b'mezid, bein mischavin, or shein mischavin, whether you had intention or you didn't have any intention. Bein derech yerida or derech aliyah, which is discussed at great length in the second parak of Makos, that if you hit derech yerida, so then you go to Golus. If it's derech aliyah, as a machlokas, is that karav l'oinis, kind of b'mezid. But it doesn't make any difference how you took this blow or gave this blow. In all these situations, you're chayav to pay. The fact is, you cause damage to an animal. We don't care, even if it was done b'shogeg. The din is they are always going to be chayav. So since that is the din when it comes to an animal, and it also mentions maki adam, we say like this: af maki adam lo tachloik boy. There's no difference ben b'shogeg, ben b'mezid, ben mischaven, lo she'ein mischaven, ben derech yerida, lo derech aliyah, lo chayv mamon, lo paiter mamon. So we see that really they should not be arguing when it comes to Chayve Misas Shaygin, because when it comes to Chayve Misas Shaygin, l'chayro, we see beferish that everyone would hold that you would not be chayav to pay according to this interpretation. So therefore, how could we say that Reish Lakish, Rabbi Yochanan argue there? L'chayro, this seems to be a statement that no one disagrees with. El Kiyasa Rabin Omer, he says, Chayve Misas Shaygin, you're right. Kuliyam u'apligi de Peturin, you're right. Based on this drasha, when a person would do something in which they would receive the death penalty, but instead, since it was done b'shogeg, the din is you do not have to pay. And the reason is because of the Tana de Beichizkia, which we all agree with, Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. Ki pligi. So therefore, where do they actually argue? B'chayvi malchus shaygin v'davar acher. So you're right, they actually only argue, let's just focus on the first case, of Chayvi Malchus Shaygin, that you really did an action that you should be Chayv Malchus, but since it was done b'Shaygeg, the question is there a din tashlumin? So Rav Yochanan Chayv Misas Iskush Chavi Malchus Luiskush. When we make a comparison of a person to an animal, that's only referring to Chavi Misus, and actually killing, but not anything which is referring to Malchus. Malchus, we don't compare a person to an animal. And therefore, if a person would do something which would be Chayiv Malchus, but since it was done b'shoigeg, according to Rabbi Yochanan, he says they would be Chayiv. Again, because Chayiv Malchus lo iskush. Rish Lakish Emer Potter. Beferish Ripsa Torah, Chayiv Malchus ke Chayiv Misus. Explicitly is in the Torah, doesn't really say where, the Gemara is going to ask this in a second, right now actually, that we compare Chayiv Malchus to Chayiv Misus. So therefore, whatever the din are when it comes to Chayiv Misus, which we said that you're going to be Pater Matashlumin, even if it was B'shoigeg, so too you're going to be Pater B'shoigeg Bar Chayiv Malchus. So where do we see this? Hechen Rifsa Torah. Where is this explicitly mentioned? So Rabbi Asi Rasha. He says it's derived through Gzer Shava. Says Rashi, B'chavi Misus Asher Hu Rasha Wamos, and by Chavi Malchus it says V'hayim Bin Hakas Rasha. So therefore we make a connection between Malchus and Misa. Rabbi Omer Asi Maki. By Malchus also there's a hekish to Maki Behema. And he says Rashi says V'lam Gzer Shava, the Chavi Misus Yelfina. Okay. So regardless, this is how Reish Lakish learns, because we learn out that Chavi Malchus has the same dinim as Chavi Misus, Shaygin, and therefore you're Pater. You're Pater B'tashlumin. So Amli Rab Papal Rabba. So hey Maike, where do we find this extra word? Ile Mamaki Behemi Shomeno Maki Yodem Yomus. Yumos, is that where we're deriving this from? Hi B'katoliksiv. That doesn't make sense, because this pasuk is talking about where he will actually be sentenced to death. Ella haimaiki makin nefesh behemi shomena nefesh tachas nefesh. If a person hits an animal, he'll have to pay, and it says nefesh tachas nefesh. So samachlei v'ish kitin mum ba'misoy kashirosa kini yasaloi. And when it says if a person places a mum on his friend, as he did, so will happen to him. Notice he'll also get a blemish, namely that he'll receive malchus. V'hai la maikehi. He says, what do you mean? This is not a malchus. So anon hakah kamrinon. So actually, we're deriving this from a hakah. Says Rashi, umum aldi hakah hunitain. And the mum was through a hakah. I v'ha tiksiv b'chayvel b'chaveroi hudiksiv. But this is derived from chayvel b'chaveroi. V'chavel b'chavero bar tarshluminhu, says Rashi. V'hechi mukmislei at b'malchus upater mamoin. How can you derive from here that you're going to be pater from mammon in this case? So where it says im enu inyan lahakah sheish b'hashava pruta, if we're talking about a case where there's a hakah which is a shava pruta, so to the in lahakah she'en b'shava pruta. So you're pater by Chavi Malchus Shaygin because of this. Says Rashi, lahakah she'en b'shava pruta ul malchus. And therefore, since there's a hakah she'en b'shava pruta, so there's no din tashlumin, instead there's malchus. The iskish shlomaki behema who shaloi tachlak boy. So because we're talking about a hakah she'en b'shava pruta, which obviously is not a case where there's a din tashlumin, so therefore that is the connection to the case of Misa, or the case of Misa to the Behema, and therefore we say there's no distinction between them. So therefore, according to Reish Lakish, he in fact says that this is the din, that when it comes not only by Chayvi Misa's Shaygigin, but even Chayvi Malchus Shaygigin, the din is you're going to be potter from Tashlumin. As we continue now to Lamed Hey Amid Beis. So the Gemara says, but at the very end, no matter how you want to interpret this, V'la bar tashluminhu. This is not a case where a person will have to pay. Says Rashi, Hai lo tachlak boy l'chavi mamon, taima mishum de'ein bo kedei tashlumin, v'lo mishum hakesha. The reason why you're pater from tashlumin, if it's a hakah she'en bo sheva pruta, is because there's nothing to pay. Avol heicha di'esh bo sheva pruta, ema tachlik. Maybe when it comes to a situation where the hakah is of a significant blow, maybe in fact you do have to pay tashlumin by by a case of shaygig. Lotzricha, so Gemara says, the bahade dechayam kara shiroyin delay. That while you were hitting him, even though it was pachas misheva pruta, you also rended his garment. Kolomer says Rashi, Vashmi'inan, the loiket, it's coming to tell you get malchus, mishum chavala, for hitting, upater matashlumi kriya. And the fact that you also rended this person's garment, you're also going to be pater. Loshna hisru bo, loshna lo hisru, dulo loki. You'll never get, even if without hasra. Pater matashlumin mehakesha dolotachlik. So we're using this as an unusual circumstance that we're saying it's talking about a hakash shemoshever pruta, and therefore the din would be you be chai malchus. But there's also potentially at the same time, if you rended someone's garment, in which there would normally be a chiv tashlumin, so we say you're pater from tashlumin. So Amalei Rav Chil or Rava Ulatanda de Bechizkia, Diermer Maki Adam Maki Behema. That he talks about this situation of this connection between the animal that you're always going to be chayav to pay, a person that you killed, you're always going to be pater. How do we know that we're talking about a case that it's a weekday? And Rashi says, Dipshitale de Maki Behema ben shagig ben mezid chayav l'shalim, and it's obvious that if you harm this animal and you have to pay for it, so ksiv b'leik lefluge, and there's no one to argue. Dilma b'Shabbos ksiv. Maybe we're talking about a case of Shabbos, says Rashi. B'al karchach ashagig ksiv. If it's on Shabbos and you're machal Shabbos, but if it was b'mezid, then you have bigger problems. It would be misa. So it must be we're talking about a case of shagig. That's what the pasuk's talk about. Di b'mezid havilei mischai b'navshai upatim et tashlumin. You wouldn't have to pay. The fact that we're talking over here that you have to pay for this animal obviously cannot be that you did it on Shabbos b'mezid, because then you would be pater because you're chai misa. So maybe we're going to say, in fact, that it happened on Shabbos, and the case is that it was done b'shogeg, and that's the reason why you're going to be pater from tashlumin. V'leik lefluge dilma b'Shabbos ksiv the behema gufa ika lefluge, and then maybe when it comes to the animal itself, we could make a distinction between shagig and mezid. Again, if it was done b'mezid, obviously you're going to be pater because you're going to be chayiv misa. If it was done b'shagig, then you're going to be chayiv because you are not going to be chayiv misa. So it's possible you can actually be mechalik within the animal itself. So why do we say that, it doesn't make any difference if it's Shabbos, if it's talking about a weekday, and it doesn't make any difference if it was b'shagig b'mezid, you're always going to be chayiv? Maybe it's talking about it was done on Shabbos. So let's talk about that. So what exactly is this connection to these two? It cannot be, we're talking about it was on Shabbos and it was b'shagig. Why? Because idolo asrbe, if this person did not get hasra, maki adam ama yumos, then why would this person be sentenced to death? It must be because he was given hasra. Now, if he was Shabbos, it's hard to understand this. It doesn't make sense. If it was on Shabbos, then Maki Behemi Shomena, why would you have to pay? Well, again, you'd be chayiv because you got hasra. Rather, it must be talking about that this happened during the week, and therefore this pasuk is telling when it comes to an animal, there's no distinction whether it was b'shogig or b'mezid. The din is that you always have to pay, and therefore when it comes to a adam, when it comes to Misas Chayvim Misas Shagigin, doesn't make any difference. You never have to pay. According to Rabbi Yomi, that he said, this is according to Rabbi Meir. He said Chidushu Shechitshu Taira, that when it comes to Knas, it's a special Chidush. That even though Rabbi Meir holds that you can end up getting both Misa, you can end up having Misa and Mammon. That's only when it's kanas, because it's a chiddush. But mammon, like just having to pay Karen, then itself maybe you're pater from. So because he says chiddushu shechitcha Torah, but kanas, then only when it comes to kanas that we have this chiddush that maybe you still have to pay it even though you're chayim misa. Now v'yafa gav the mikdal, as he said, even if you're going to be sentenced to death, mishalom, you still have to pay the kanas. Masnisin kaman moikamah. So the question is, our masnisin, who do we explain it like? It says Rashi l'shnuyi rumi the ramina la the elu hein haloikin. So he said in the case in Makos that when it comes to chayvi krisus, a person's boil his sister, so there's a chayv krisus, but he also says you get malchus. So we ended up paskening in loikum mishalim that you don't have to have both. Now ikra meir. Now if it's according to Rameir who holds that loikum mishalim, you can just say, the reason why you get malchus over there, and it says kanas in our Mishnah, is because you actually are a chayv to do both. So kasha bitoi. We had a question when it says by bito, because according to him, l'chayra the din should be that you should still be chayiv, not just by a case of kares, but also a case of misa, like having beer with your daughter. So we'd have a question on that. Ikra nechunim and akana. According to Nechunim and Akanas, Rashi says the Isli Nami Loikim Shalim Rameir, that he actually does also agree to Rameir that a person could get malchus and pay at the same time. Kasha Chaisai. So there's a question of achosa on him. Says Rashi, he Nami the Mishum Malchus Lopaterle Lopatri Mishum Kares. Ikrab Yitzchak Kasha Mamzeres. Why? Says Rashi. When it comes to mamzeres, everyone says you get malchus. The katani isel kanas, but yet there's also din kanas. But how can you get both? So hanicha isavela krav yochanan. It makes sense if he holds like Rav Yochanan that he said that the whole case of why our Mishnah says there's no malchus is because there was no hasra for it. That's the reason why Rashi says the mishalim that you have to pay. The chavi malchus shaygin v'davar achar chayiv, because he holds, as we said before, that if when it comes to chavi malchus shaygin, you could be chayiv to have to pay. So if you were given if there was no hasra for the malchus, so then you have to pay the tashlumin. So that's what it is. A chavi malchus shaygin, according to him, he holds that you are going to be chayiv. So again, it makes sense if he holds like the sheet of Rabbi Yochanan, who nami metarts like Rabbi Yochanan, Eli savar kareish lakish. But he says like the other opinion of Reish Lakish, who says that our Mishnah is talking about a case of a naira is why it's kanas, but the case in Makkas is talking about a bulgaris or a girl who is the Yisayma, who's not shaykh to receiving the kanas, and that's why she gets malchus. So heichem etartzla. So how is he able to answer it? So it must be al karchak Rabbi Yochanan svirulei. We're forced to say that he holds actually like Rabbi Yochanan, as we said. Rabbi Yochanan holds the chiluk is whether or not there's hasra or not hasra, and therefore the reason why it says that you will have to pay kanas is because we're talking about a case of chavi malchus shaygin. Now Reish Lakish holds chavi malchus shaygin your pater, which is the reason why it's a problem according to him. According to Rabbi Yochanan, he holds chavi malchus shaygin your chayiv to pay. And that's why our Mishnah says you're chayav to pay kanas, because it's talking about a case where you didn't give the hasra on the malchus, so therefore you have to pay. Fine. According to Reish Lakish, he said that beferish rifs and he compares chavi malchus to chavi misos, that just like chavi misos shaygin, as we compare to the behema, that you always have the din is you're always pater from paying. So too, when it comes to chavi malchus shaygin, you're always pater from paying. Mantana the palguled Rav Nechunim ben Akana. So who is the Tana that argues with him? So Rameir, Rav Yitzchak. So it could be like Rameir, because Rameir says loikim mishalim. He says you could get both. So again, as we said, our Mishnah says there's kanas. That Mishnah says there's malchus. So fine, that's like Rameir. Or it could be like Rav Yitzchak, because Rashi says lo shaykh malchus bechavi krisus, that there's no din malchus when it comes to krisus. Ugzer shava the asayin leislain doesn't hold the gzer shava. My lifter hilkoch masnisin the hachal karchach ramerhi v'lo Rav Yitzchak mishum the kashim mamzeres, etc. So in other words, our Mishnah that says that there is a chiv knas has to be like the shita of Rab Meir. Okay, let's see a couple of questions. We're going to stop by the 2 dots, which we just did. Question 3. Ksiv maki nefesh behema yishalmena nefesh tachas nefesh v'samach lev ish ki yitain mumba misai. So man nilmad mismichais lazu, which is at least according to the Shita of Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish says that not only when it comes to malchus to chayvi misa shaygin, but also chayvi malchus shaygin, he compares that also to a behema. Just like a behema, we don't make a difference between this b'shogir b'mezid. You always are obligated to pay for damaging and killing this animal. So too, when it comes to chavi malchus shaygin, you're also patur from paying. So it's not just by chayve misa shaygin that divir kol. Everyone holds like this drasha. Even Rabbi Yochanan, the Reish Lakish, says that din could also be applied to chayve malchus shaygin as well. Okay. Question TA 19. The ish kitin mumba mitai kasher asa kinyan asan loy. The Gemara darish le'inin malchus the kamashmon the loike ve'in mishalim. Madua chayim malchus v'haba chavola mishalim ve'in loike. Well, chayro, why would you be chayim malchus? Why would you be chayiv? It's a chavola you hit, and we know it's chayva b'chavero. The din is you're supposed to pay. Right? So we end up saying that it must be because the Hakash Moshe Bapruta. The Heich Yolav Mahacha, the like of in Mishalim. So he says like this: Ari Bahakash Moshe Bapruta, Bechia Gavna, the Bahadi, the Machyekar Shirain delay, which again is a shtickle, a difficult idea, but this is how we understood it. That in the first of all, we're talking about a Hakash Moshe Bapruta. And since it's a Hakash Shem Bo Sheva Pruta, obviously it's only shaykh to discuss the situation of getting malchus, because there's no mumman, because there's no din tashlumin. So therefore, that is how we're establishing that this is a case of chayve malchus shaygin. But nonetheless, TA 19, we extend it and say, so why would you learn out from there that there's no din tashlumin when it comes to chayve malchus shaygin? There's nothing to pay. So as we said, tzricha the bahadi machikra shirayin delay. So even though at that moment you actually rended and ripped someone's garment, so therefore because of that you would think you should also have a chiyuv to pay. So this is coming to tell you the chiddush that when it comes to chavi malchus shaygin that you are pater. TB 21, we did that. TB 22, tomorrow's daf.com.